This armored money transfer truck looks normal, like any random van, so as not to attract attention. But it is bulletproof and very well reinforced against any possible break-in attempts. Literally, it's almost impossible to break in or open it from outside. Even if you use a grenade or some sort of bomb, it won't be an easy task. In today's story, the van was parked in a mall. The driver was sitting inside the van, and his partner went down to the mall in order to fulfill his duties. A few minutes later, when the partner returned, he was surprised that the van had vanished with more than $1 million in it. When the police arrived at the scene, they were baffled by the realization that no one around the area saw or heard anything unusual. If it was a robbery, it could only be executed by using extreme force or a bomb to blow the van's doors. In this case, someone from the bystanders can catch a glimpse of what's going on. How did this happen? Did the driver have something to do with it? Did the thieves invent a brilliant way to seize it in complete silence? But how? Let's delve into it. We all agree that armored vans are heavily armored, and the driver and the guards in them are armed to ensure a safe transport of money between businesses and banks. One of the largest money companies in America is called Wells Fargo, and this company has a fleet of trucks and vehicles for transporting money in various shapes and sizes. On November 28, 1994, near this mall in Arizona State, the armored van pulled into a parking lot. The van looked simple from the outside, but in reality it was one of the cash transport trucks belonging to the Wells Fargo company. The truck, despite its ordinary appearance, was heavily fortified and armored. All the exterior structure and glass were bulletproof, and it had armored plates all around. Plus, the doors cannot be opened from the outside. The van was designed to look ordinary in order to not get too much attention. Inside the van there were two people, the driver and the money collector, both armed with guns. After the responsible person of collecting the money stepped out of the van to collect the money from the mall, the driver stayed inside to wait. The collector entered the mall and went to the financial department. After they count all the money and sign some papers, the collector takes it. After he matched all the numbers, he grabbed the bag and headed back to the van. On his arrival at the parking lot, he was surprised to not see the van. He checked right and left, but the armored van disappeared. He then called 911 and informed them of the matter. The police were immediately dispatched to the area, and the FBI was also informed, because any case related to money transport trucks is a federal case offense. The police and FBI arrived in the area, and all they had was the collector to start with. He informed them that during his time of leaving the van to the time he came back, it took him less than 5 minutes, and he stated that around $1 million was in the van. And remember, that's 1994. In today's money with inflation, this amount would reach more than $2 million. After that, the investigators interviewed the people around the area where the armored van had just vanished. To their surprise, no one seemed to have a clue or knew anything about what they were talking about. The FBI agents didn't find a single witness, and they couldn't figure out how it was possible. All the people who were in the mall parking lot or around it said that things were calm and normal. If it was a robbery, the only way was to explode the door with a bomb or strong pressure. In this case, everyone in that parking lot would pay attention. Also, if someone tries to open the doors from outside, the van has an alarm designed to go off in case of a forced entry. The investigators couldn't wrap their heads around the truth about an armored van disappearing in such a quiet and suspicious way, so they came up with the idea that the driver probably had something to do with it. It's either he drove off with the money, or he had accomplices, or he was threatened, or he cooperated with a gang. At the time of the incident, it was the only logical approach or understanding of what truly happened, knowing for a fact that in so many cases it was an inside job. So they started by focusing on the driver. His name was John McCoach, a 53-year-old man. Police and the FBI canvassed the area looking for the van. They knew that the person responsible for the heist would try to get rid of the van as soon as possible, so they focused their research on the neighboring perimeter around the mall. And they had air search to help by deploying a helicopter to try and locate the vehicle. The search lasted for quite some time. Meanwhile, the FBI focused on finding out more about John McCoach, the driver. The first thing they found was that John wasn't a troublemaker. His criminal record was neat. Then they got a search warrant to take a look at his apartment. Inside his apartment, everything seemed to be in its right spot. No clothes taken or bags packed. The apartment looked very normal. They interviewed his friends and family and all agreed about one thing. John is a hardworking man who takes his job seriously and is a good family man. The detectives realized that they were facing a hard task, so they decided to ask for help from the public. The police and the FBI organized a press conference explaining the details of the case and asked anyone with information that might help them to call the Crime Stop line or to go to a police station. They also released pictures of the van and its missing driver, Jan Makoch, and they announced that there is a reward of $60,000 for anyone who has information that leads to solving the case. Just after a few hours, a report was received by the police from someone saying that he saw a van similar to the one stolen with the same license plate parked in a church's parking lot. Police rushed to the area and they found the van parked. The engine was on, and there was no way to get inside. Agents have to wait until the company's security specialists unlock it from the outside. That's how impenetrable the vehicle was. Once they were granted access, they were shocked to find the driver, Jan Makoch, shot but still breathing. He later died in the hospital due to severe blood loss. After inspecting the inside of the van, they noticed that there were no signs of a violent break-in. The instigators were highly aware of what they were facing because the operation was carefully planned and executed with high professionalism. From the silent robbery at the mall, the place where they left the van, and the short time it took to execute their plan, FBI agents knew that this case would be a tough one. They checked for any forensic evidence. All they came across were some fingerprints left by the different employees that had access to the van. The robbers left some bags of money, but mostly coins and metal currencies, avoiding extra weight. Investigators at this point were clueless and had no trail, not a single one. Their analysis of the whole operation gave them some heads up of what the possible profiles of the perpetrators are. The spot where they left the van suggested they knew how law enforcement proceeded. That's the reason why they left the van right in the next city, which is in a different jurisdiction of the main police department where the crime happened. A small loophole that gives them enough time to escape, while the two departments try to coordinate their efforts. The autopsy of Jan Makoch revealed small fragments of the bullet that killed him. They were too small to be submitted to any further checks or ballistic tests. The only revealing fact was that the bullet was fired from a 9 to 13-foot distance between the assailant and the driver, because it wasn't containing any gun residue. After a few days, a witness named Morgan came in with new details of the incident. He said that in the moment of the event, he was crossing the street with his bike and noticed the van speeding, followed by a red pickup truck. His memories of the event were vague, and he couldn't remember any faces or numbers. Since Morgan was the only solid link to the robbery that day, the FBI asked him to consent to a deep hypnosis session conducted by a specialist of the Bureau, which Morgan agreed to. The specialist is a doctor with knowledge of psychology and neurological stimulation. Deep hypnosis serves to boost and refresh the memory of an individual in the hope of remembering more specific details. The human brain has very high abilities, and due to reducing stress and other factors, it stores thousands of pieces of information in the subconscious. The goal of the hypnosis was to make Morgan relive the moment when he saw the robbers and try to recount the event and hope to extract some valuable leads. During the session, Morgan was able to remember that there were two people inside the van, and after they crossed the road next to him, a red pickup truck followed behind with just a driver inside. He also recalled that the license plate has the numbers 2, 3, and 7, but not in an organized way. The FBI investigators tried to find any red pickup truck with a license plate that had the 3 numbers, but it was overwhelming because the record showed thousands of trucks. The reason was that all the pickups were registered without specifying their colors, which made it impossible to identify. The FBI interrogated over 200 people with any small suspicion, or who have or had a pickup truck with the numbers on it. But after weeks and weeks of following that lead, they couldn't get anywhere, so they set it aside. Morgan was also able to remember one of the robbers' faces. With the help of a sketch artist, a face started to take shape. A white man with a round beard and long hair. This drawing was published in the media. After a few days of leaking the sketch to the public, a woman called in saying that one of her friends, Jody, suspected her boyfriend to be the perpetrator, but she was terrified to call on him. Police checked the woman's name and noticed she had a few unpaid traffic tickets. They showed up at her workplace using the tickets as a means to invite her to the department to avoid any suspicion towards her so they could talk more about the robbery. After talking to the woman in question, they instantly found out the other friend, Jody, had more to say about the case. The FBI went and met her and warned her about the consequences of lying in a federal case. She agreed to talk. She told investigators that her boyfriend, James Greenham, looked identical to the sketch, and she said that she tried to talk to him about it, but he never gave her a clear answer. He asked her what her reaction would be if suddenly he became rich, trying to throw her off. She stated that he had a friend, Timothy Ring, a longtime friend with whom James spent most of his free time. She added that both of them were broke, but suddenly they started buying some stuff out of their budget, like motorcycles, jet skis, and watches. After this short chat with Jody, the detectives were sure that they had caught a solid fish. But Jody's testimony wasn't enough. Her words were valuable, but they needed physical evidence, and they wanted to know how they gained access inside the van. Did they know the driver prior to the incident? Did they threaten him or his family? What exactly happened? Investigators checked Timothy's background, and the first thing they uncovered was that Timothy has a red pickup truck similar to the one Morgan identified. The only thing was that it didn't have the same 3 numbers, but still another good substantial clue. Timothy was also an informant for the FBI in the past. They also learned that James and Timothy worked as prison guards, and they were highly trained in the use of guns and ammunition, which could possibly make it hard to surveil and monitor their moves. The investigators issued a 24-hour surveillance on both of them, and because of their prior jobs and their high alert, a helicopter was also appointed to track them in case the land operation couldn't keep up. After a couple of days, it became obvious that both Timothy and James were spending way too much money, and both didn't have a job or a stable income at the time. Every movement or encounter between the two and the external world was filmed and captured. The FBI investigators were sure that they had a third or more accomplice, and they had to apprehend him as well. One guy keeps popping up in both operations, a man with a black beard who will soon be identified as William Ferguson. Ferguson was a retired police officer put on early leave because of some problems during his service. His profile and background landed him on the FBI spectrum, and he was added to the surveillance program. James Greenham, Timothy Ring, and William Ferguson. During the course of the operation, a man named Michael Sunders went to talk with inspectors. He was supposed to be the 4th person in the robbery, but for some reason they ditched him a couple of days before November 28th. Furious, he decided to turn them in. Sunders, during his interview, mentioned a person, a cop, as he said, but he didn't know his name at the time. He referred to him as Fergie. It just added to what the police already know, but it sure reassured them that they are going in the right direction. Sunders' words were just speculation since he couldn't back them up with proofs or evidence, so he was allowed to leave. One of the investigators' techniques of keeping the 3 under the microscope was to check in their garbage every time they tossed something. In one of the bags, they found a map of the armored truck's itineraries. It shows the different roads the vans take around the city. This isn't, of course, a smoking gun proof, but it sure adds up to the detectives' suspicions. The surveillance operation became too much for the Bureau, and the results weren't as conclusive as expected. During the surveillance, they noticed that the 3 favorite places to meet were James's apartment. He was the only one that lived by himself and had no family staying with him. The best way to get a confession was to implant listening devices in Greenham's apartment. So, in one night, after James left his place, and with the help of the property's owner, some agents were able to gain access to the premises. They managed to install covert listening devices, including wires, bugs, and transmitters. Across the street from the apartment, a team was making sure everything was perfectly installed. The FBI agents were so cautious and left the place as it was found. Now they can listen to everything the 3 talk about in that small corner of the living room. To get the 3 of them to talk about the robbery, the FBI called a press conference during which they let out to the public wrong information about the case. They announced that they were looking for black and bold suspects with incoherent descriptions, so the three will be very confident. Well, that's exactly what happened. The three fixed a rendezvous to meet, and the FBI, on the other hand, sat comfortably to monitor their conversation. The three were making fun of the investigation and made silly jokes. But the surprising thing is that, at any given moment, they never incriminated themselves directly with direct endorsement of the crime or taking responsibility for it. For the FBI, it was a big missing piece of the puzzle to get a slam dunk on the case, knowing that the Bureau tends not to leave any reasonable doubt when the case goes to the court. But in general, the proof they have already gathered isn't bad. In one of the phone calls intercepted between Timothy and William, the two were discussing the risk of buying new fancy cars, worried about the bad attention that might come with it.
Yeah, the only problem with BMWs is they draw a lot of attention. See, nobody thinks about anything if you buy a Pontiac.
Oh, I was thinking about that too.
You know, all of a sudden a BMW's parked in your driveway, I guarantee you're going to be in trouble.
I'm tempted to go get myself a Z anyways. I really am. I'm very, very, very tempted.
Well, I think you should wait.
Oh, no Fergie.
Well, I'm just checking.
Jesus Christ.
The discussion didn't end there. Timothy was complaining about Greenham and how weak he became.
Yeah, he was doing so good too, but not anymore. I cut him off.
Well, that'll fuck up one of our plans.
What's that?
What was they going to fuck up north?
I don't mean getting rid of him. Oh, just cutting him off as far as supplying him with what he needs to be that way. You don't understand. I hold both his and mine. I have it. He doesn't.
This discussion was clear to investigators that Timothy was the mastermind, and he also had James's share of money, and by doing so, he can keep him in control. William seemed to get along well with Timothy, but James was just a puppet under Timothy's fingers. Tim, in most discussions intercepted, sounded more aggressive with anger issues. They concluded that James was the weakest link in the chain. In some pictures, he was seen running errands for Tim and buying him clothes, including underwear. The investigators wanted to put more pressure on James to crack him and get him to freak out. One day, they left a copy of the sketch resembling him near his door. When James saw it, he couldn't believe his eyes, but he managed to calm down. The idea of the FBI playing these tricks on him didn't strike him hard. He was thinking that someone from the neighbors was messing around with him, due to the resemblance, probably out of pure jealousy. After a couple of days, they left an FBI agent card near his door. Behind the card was written, Proof 173. James, after finding the card and checking it, became terrified. And once he flipped it, he knew he was in bigger trouble. He ran to his car and started to drive away. This time, only the helicopter was following him. He drove deep into the desert and stopped to call Timothy. Let's listen to him.
There's a detective at my house.
Over what?
I don't know.
Is that right?
He left his business card. Tom Clayton, senior investigator.
I don't know what that would be, but there's nothing to sweat.
Timothy tried his best to calm him and reassure him that everything was okay. He advised him to go back home and act like everything was normal. Then tomorrow they could meet. James went back to his apartment and slept. The next day, Timothy went to meet James. And I don't need to remind you that the place was wired up and investigators listened to everything. They talked for over an hour, and Tim was trying his best to calm James. At the end, Timothy told him that if the police or FBI had anything against him, they would have already shown up at his door and put him in handcuffs. After that, investigators came to the conclusion that they heard a lot, and the amount of evidence they had was even more substantial, but it was pointing directly to them. They issued an order to arrest the three men, and in the next morning, police headed to their homes. James Greenham's arrest was smooth. William Ferguson resisted for quite a bit, but surrendered later. As for Timothy Ring, because he was an informant, the FBI called him and ordered him to come to their offices to discuss an old case that they worked together in the past. Timothy took the bait and agreed to meet, having no idea of what's about to happen. With Timothy, the FBI opted for this method to arrest him because he was the most agitated and dangerous one out of the three. The FBI didn't want to take the risk of going and arresting him at his home to avoid any altercations or a possible shootout between cops and him, and by inviting him in, he can't even carry any weapons with him to the inside. The 3 robbers were apprehended and were taken into custody. Next thing, the FBI searched their homes, and the first thing they found was a handwritten paper at Timothy's house mentioning how to split the money between the 3. The paper has the first letter of each name of the 3 and the amount of money stolen with a share given to each individual. The paper was sealed and added to the proofs. The red pickup truck was stationed in his garage, but the license plate didn't have the numbers 2, 3, and 7 seen by the witness during the hypnosis session. Investigators weren't surprised. Maybe the witness couldn't remember well. They also retrieved a big bag full of cash in his garage. And following the search of all 3 houses, they retrieved almost the full amount stolen. Only $120,000 were missing from the $1 million taken from the van. It was probably what the 3 had spent during the 3 months. At that point, with the mounting evidence, the prosecution had nothing to worry about. Timothy and William refused any type of cooperation with investigators. James was the only one that showed some guilt and remorse regarding his actions. They interviewed him for several hours and put so much pressure on him until he started talking. He told investigators that Tim was the one who shot and killed John McCutch, the driver of the armored van. After this confession, James agreed to cooperate with police and answered most of the questions. He told them that they had started planning the robbery 6 months prior, and Timothy was the mastermind and the one who encouraged them to join. At the beginning, they proceeded by following many armored vans, tracking every movement and drawing the itinerary of each one of them. Take note of each stop, an unusual move. After a few months of stalking and tracking, they spotted their goal, the armored van that John was driving. They studied meticulously every small move the van made in the course of months. One of the reasons why they picked that specific van was that the van stops near the mall around noon, a time when there weren't many people walking around, and John had one specific spot where he always parked his van. All this facts pointed toward that van, and the mall was almost the last stop to get cash from. And if it's the last stop, it means the van has already collected a large amount of money from different businesses and shops during the morning. Before heading back to the bank, the 3 wanted to strike when the van had almost made all its stops, so the money would be a lot. But the most important reason of all mentioned was that the driver always smokes a cigarette at this exact spot. John cracks the van's door open a little bit because the windows are always locked and starts enjoying his dose of nicotine. Of course, it's against all armored vans' policies to keep a door open during the fulfillment of duty. The desire to smoke was not negotiable to John. Of course, the robbers planned it all well. They picked the 28th of November, which is Thanksgiving, a day on which all shops, restaurants, and businesses make some considerable extra amounts of money. So even the date was one piece of this meticulous plan. On the day of the robbery, James Greenham and William Ferguson waited. They waited first for the collector to step out of the armored van and go further to collect the cash. Right after that, they noticed the driver slightly open the door to smoke. The gap was like 10 to 15 inches, a small gap for an average shooter, but for someone highly trained like Timothy Ring, it was enough to shoot and snipe the driver. Timothy sat aside inside his pickup truck, 10 miles away from the van, and right when John McGock made a small opening in his door, Timothy aimed at him. His rifle was equipped with a silencer to suppress the sound of the shot. One shot, right in the head. The driver collapsed into the passenger seat. It was known later that the driver didn't die instantly. An autopsy revealed that he was probably alive during the whole robbery. James and William rushed inside the van and then sped off with it. Timothy followed the van with his red pickup truck. It took them less than 3 minutes to carry out their attack, and it was quiet without any noise or witnesses. No one seemed to have noticed the slightest disorder. The van was taken outside the city to the church. In the church parking lot, the 3 transferred the money to the pickup truck, took all the cash, and left the coins behind. They drove to a remote area in the desert and got rid of all incriminating evidence. They burned their clothes and all the tools used to carry out the robbery. James revealed to the investigators that they used a fake license plate during the robbery, and they buried it with the burned clothes and tools in the desert. James agreed to take them to where they burned the evidence, and the investigators were able to find the license plate. And to the big surprise of everyone, the witness, Morgan, was right about the 3 numbers, 2, 3, and 7. The hypnosis session turned out to be accurate to a baffling and a normal level. At the end, the three were prosecuted. James Greenham and William Ferguson had a reduced sentence, which was around 30 years in prison. For Timothy, and because he was the mastermind of the robbery and the one behind the killing of John, his sentence could be higher. At the beginning of his trial, he pleaded not guilty, but the jurors found him guilty. He was sentenced to death in 1997, but the case was taken to the Supreme Court, and the death sentence was changed to life in prison without possibility of parole.